1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6.
إعلان مهم.
重要提示
Important announcement.
Message important.
Важное объявление.
Anuncio importante.
يرجى من المتحدثين الكرام إلقاء بياناتهم بسرعة معقولة لضمان ترجمة فورية وافية وعالية الجودة.
为了帮助口译准确完整传递发言信息，请代表发言时语速不要过快。
Speakers are kindly reminded to deliver their statements at a reasonable pace to ensure complete and quality interpretation.
Il est rappelé aux orateurs qu'ils doivent présenter leur déclaration à un rythme raisonnable afin de garantir une interprétation complète et de qualité.
Напоминаем ораторам, что для того, чтобы устный перевод был полным и качественным, необходимо выступать в умеренном темпе.
Se ruega a los oradores que pronuncien sus declaraciones a un ritmo razonable para garantizar una interpretación íntegra y de calidad.
Excellencias,
Excellencies, distinguished participants, I hereby declare open the 22nd meeting of the 62nd session of the Human Rights Council. Excellencies, distinguished colleagues, I now give the floor to His Excellency Mr. Tariq Mitri, Deputy Prime Minister of the Republic of Lebanon. You have the floor, Excellency.
Mr. President, Excellencies and distinguished guests, I'm grateful for the opportunity to address you, not only as Deputy Prime Minister of Lebanon, but as the President of the National Commission on International Humanitarian Law. I have come to you with our longing towards a durable cessation of hostilities and not only a precarious de-escalation. We are fully aware that healing the wounds of war will be a long and difficult process. In this vein, documenting the suffering of civilians and protecting their rights are vital to us, but also to all those who uphold international law and universal humanist values. As we meet today, an assessment team appointed by the Office of the High Commissioner on Human Rights conducts its work in Lebanon, gathering information and evidence on the alleged violations and abuses of human rights, laws, and international humanitarian law perpetrated by all parties to the conflict. On April 9, the High Commissioner condemned the massive wave of strikes and the destruction that was nothing short of horrific, and he demanded an independent investigation into all potential violations of international humanitarian law. On the preceding day, more than 350 civilians were killed and 1,200 civilians were injured in Beirut after 100 indiscriminate Israeli airstrikes within 10 minutes. Today, the number of civilians killed since the outbreak of the war that Lebanon was dragged into exceeds 4,000, and the injured are over 12,000. Large figures show the scale of harm, but not less important are the tragic stories of women and men behind these numbers, including scores of those who should have had a special protection, such as journalists, healthcare, and rescue workers. Civilians killed in the last 3-4 months are not collateral damage, no matter if some of the airstrikes had a specific target as it is claimed. Attacks have been recurrent. Many did not have a clearly identifiable military objective. The principles of humanitarian law are clear. Civilians must be protected, and parties to a conflict must distinguish military objectives and civilians at all times. I'm here to express our deepest concern that Israeli attacks in and on Lebanon have, in all likelihood, violated repeatedly the principles of distinction, proportionality, and precaution, the three fundamental pillars of international humanitarian law. Unlawful mass evacuation is another breach of the Fourth Geneva Convention. Military orders to civilian residents, asking them to evacuate their towns and villages, and declaring those towns and villages as no return zones, did provoke an unprecedented mass displacement. Evacuation orders depopulating more than 70 towns and villages did not necessarily guarantee safe passages of civilian inhabitants and were a prelude to a near total destruction, making those towns and villages inhabitable. Testimonies, photos, and satellite imagery bear witness to the sweeping devastation of large parts of southern Lebanon, where not only homes were destroyed, but bridges, roads, places of worship, and cultural heritage. A senior official in Israel did not hesitate to claim responsibility for an extended herbicide, saying, "We have flattened the entire first line of villages in southern Lebanon. All the houses have been destroyed. The residents will never see them standing again." Your Excellency, a detailed report collecting evidence and offering legal analysis prepared by our National Commission is at your disposal. It is our hope that your Council, committed to the principles and Charter of the United Nations, will reaffirm that the protection of human rights in Lebanon and everywhere, and in Lebanon, like everywhere, protection of human rights are the foundations of justice and peace. Thank you very much.
Muchas gracias, Excelencia.
I thank you, Excellency, for your statement. We shall now continue the interactive dialogue with the Special Rapporteur on the situation of human rights in Burundi. We continue with the list of speakers for national human rights institutions and non-governmental organizations, and I call on the International Federation of ACAT. Thank you, President, Special Rapporteur, ACAT Burundi, SOS Torture Burundi, Fiakato MCT, and Ivos, thank you for your update. We are deeply concerned about the forced returns of Burundian refugees. In Tanzania, forced fingerprinting, denial of food aid for those who refuse to register for returns, and restrictions so that these returns are not voluntary. UNHRC has itself denounced the breaches of the agreement. Excellencies, like many Burundians, I wish I could return to my country and tell you that it's a country where human rights are respected and return is safe. Unfortunately, the reality is different. Abductions, arbitrary arrests, and enforced disappearances continue. And returning refugees are particularly vulnerable. Special Rapporteur, as the 2027 presidential election approaches, what steps can the international community take to prevent a further upsurge in human rights violations and protect Burundian refugees from forcible returns? Thank you. I call on the International Rehabilitation Council for Torture Victims. Mr. Vice President, the International Rehabilitation Council for Victims of Torture and partners are particularly concerned about the human rights situation in Burundi. For over a decade, civil society has had to deal with a restricted civic space under the threat of violent repression. Freedom of expression and association of the press are not guaranteed. Organizations offering rehabilitation services to victims of torture must concentrate in the capital and act with the utmost discretion. Human rights defenders, far from being protected, are targeted, intimidated, and threatened. The absence of the rule of law prevents any independent investigation. Few are successful and impunity prevails, especially since those responsible for torture are often the responsibility of the state apparatus itself. The death of the Minister of Communication, Gabi Bugaga, found lifeless on April 16, 2026, described as an accident without credible justification, illustrates this culture. If the death of a minister does not prompt any serious investigation, what can ordinary victims expect? In addition, the Rwandan border has been closed for over a year with heavy economic consequences for the border population. We ask the Special Rapporteur, what concrete steps should the state take to restore civic space ahead of next year's presidential elections? I thank you. Thank you. I give the floor for a joint statement to Vivat International.
Mr. Vice President, Vivat International and co-signing NGOs alarm this Council of the worsening humanitarian situation for Burundian refugees in Tanzania's Nyarugusu camp. Deeply concerning is the reports of military-led security operations involving severe physical violence, systematic demolition of shelters, and forced repatriation to Burundi. This escalation disproportionately harms vulnerable women, children, and persons with disabilities who are currently denied essential medical treatment. These actions directly contradicts international legal obligations under the principle of non-refoulement and fundamentally compromises the mandate of the UNHRC. Despite UN Resolution 57/22, which mandates safe reintegration of returnees, forced repatriation to Burundi poses severe risk of further torture, persecution, and re-traumatization for these survivors. We therefore call upon this Council to urgently mobilize UNHCR to expedite immediate relocation of verified protection cases to safe third countries and diplomatically engage with the Tanzanian government to halt shelter destruction until a sustainable multi-stakeholder framework is established. Thank you.
Muchas gracias. Cedo la palabra.
Thank you. I call on the Eastern Horn of Africa Human Rights Defenders Project. Thank you. Special Rapporteur, we welcome your update as we prepare for the Council's 63rd session and as the 2027 presidential election approaches, we urge states to ensure continued scrutiny of Burundi's human rights situation. We must preserve the Special Rapporteur's documentation role and his ability to report to the Council in a context of economic crisis marked by shortages of fuel, currency, and commodities. And with the conflict in the east, Burundi's civic space remains heavily constrained. Recent incidents shows how rights are interdependent and how restrictions on civil rights also affect economic and social rights. In November 2025, in Burunga province, a correspondent was targeted by members of the ruling Youth League while covering distribution of agricultural products. He was forced to delete his images. We take note of the verdict against Sandra Muhoza in April 2026. We welcome her release, but she received a 4-year sentence for undermining the integrity of the national territory and racial aversion and should never have been detained. She'd been in detention for 2 years following opaque legal proceedings. Mr. Zongo, how do you assess the evolution of civic space for those monitoring and reporting on economic, social, and cultural rights? Thank you.
Gracias.
Thank you. I call on the Human Rights Research League. Video statement. Thank you, President. We remain concerned by the Burundian government's continued refusal to engage in a national dialogue with opposition parties to address their legitimate concerns about the lack of transparency and irregularities in the electoral process. Given the last flawed election with intimidation, arbitrary arrests and forced disappearances, and the exclusion of the main opponent, the reluctance of opposition parties to participate in next year's presidential elections without a prior national dialogue, and assurances that a more transparent electoral process will be in place is quite understandable. Criticising opposition parties for their position by blaming them for the constant threat of boycott in every election cycle and accusing them of being responsible for a dysfunctional democracy, as the ruling party's National Secretary Dorian Monizero did, instead of addressing their concerns, speaks volumes. We also reiterate that the continued lack of independence and impartiality of the judiciary and the continued shrinking of civic space are incompatible with the requirement of a functioning democracy guided by the rule of law. Mr. Zongo, in this context, what should this Council and its member states do in the face of the continuing violations of democratic rights? I thank you. Thank you. I call on Interfaith International. Vice President, I thank the expert for his oral update. Since 2015, Burundi has been undergoing a multifaceted crisis with a mass influx of refugees fleeing the conflict in the east of the Republic of Congo. Women and children live in transit centers or camps without drinking water in unbearable hygiene conditions. In addition, the lack of funding is worsening the humanitarian situation. Burundi still faces internal difficulties despite the adoption of the decree on approved parties in May 2026. The restriction of the freedom of expression, assembly and participation of the political opposition is documented during the local and legislative elections of 2025. Our organization is concerned about the government's authoritarian drift, which prevents human rights defenders from playing their role in exercising and promoting the rule of law. We encourage the government to promote the return of all political exiles and to create a lasting foundation for effective peace among all Burundians. In conclusion, Interfaith International urges the Burundian authorities to fulfill their human rights obligations and to respect the international treaties. Thank you. I call on the International Organization for the Least Developed Countries. Thank you.
Mr. Vice President, Burundi risks becoming a forgotten crisis. While international attention shifts elsewhere, women and girls continue to face widespread sexual and gender-based violence, persistent exclusion, and entrenched impunity. Our partners on the ground continue to document these violations alongside civic space and ongoing barriers to education and protection. Women activists, journalists, and civil society actors face persistent harassment, intimidation, and restrictions on civic participation. This repression has a gendered impact, contributing to the silence of women in public life. When women are silenced, civic space shrinks for everyone. When violence goes unpunished, trust in institutions erodes. And when women are excluded, democratic legitimacy is undermined. The commitments of the Arusha Agreement cannot be fulfilled while women and girls continue to face violence and exclusion without justice, accountability, or redress. As Burundi moves towards the 2027 presidential elections, the protection and meaningful participation of all civilians is critical. This is central to democracy, accountability, and lasting peace. These elections present an opportunity for the government of Burundi to renew its commitment to democratic governance, ensuring that the will of the people is freely expressed through inclusive, credible, and violence-free elections, backed by real protection and accountability. Thank you.
Muchas gracias.
Thank you. I call on Cécile.
Merci, Monsieur le Président. Le CECID.
Thank you, President. CECID remains concerned that the continued harassment of civil society actors, human rights defenders, journalists, and independent media in Burundi, the environment where freedom of expression, association, and public participation is restricted, undermines the rule of law and limits the possibilities for pluralistic democratic debate. We're also concerned at the dysfunction of the judicial system, particularly when the independence of the judiciary is called into question, or when judicial proceedings are perceived as likely to affect the exercise of fundamental freedoms and citizens' trust in the institutions. We call on the Burundian authorities to favour inclusive dialogue with all socio-political actors and civil society in order to strengthen national cohesion and foster a climate conducive to reconciliation. We also call on the authorities to review the prosecution of political opponents in accordance with fair trial guarantees and to release all those detained on political grounds in accordance with the country's international obligations, as well as cooperating fully with the special procedures mandate holders. I thank you.
Muchas gracias.
Thank you. I call on the Shanxi Patriotic Volunteer Association.
President, Special Rapporteur, and delegates, I initiated the International Patriotic Pact Organization, advocating loving one's own country without harming other nations' interests. The report confirms the Burundi's severe food insecurity challenges, threatening the right to survival of millions. This again shows that for the people of Burundi, the right to development is the foundation of human rights, without which and without economic and food security, all other rights are unattainable. We believe that true patriotism lies in defending a nation's right to development and people's right to be free from hunger and poverty. We call on the international community to respect Burundi's sovereignty, cease unilateral sanctions, increase development assistance, and improve the human rights situation through cooperation rather than pressure. We invite you all to the International Patriotic Pact Organization Autumn Forum at the UN office in Nairobi on September 21st. The theme will be International Patriotic Pact and the nation's right to development. We will explore practical and feasible development paths for the Global South through the pact and the review of the nation's right to development. Please join us in this significant endeavor. Thank you, President.
Muchas gracias.
Thank you. That was the last speaker on my list. I will now give the floor to Mr. Gaitan Zongo for his concluding remarks. You have 5 minutes. You have the floor.
Merci.
Thank you. I see that there are essentially 5 major topics, and I'll try to take up all of the risk factors related to the 2027 elections, including the closure of civic space, which means there is no true counterbalance to the authorities and public opinion, as well as controlling the media. Then there's the role of partisan mobilization and restrictions on political parties within the opposition. As preventive actions, there's opening of a political inclusive dialogue. Secondly, the freeing of detainees held for political reasons. Third, unhindered access to international observers from the pre-electoral phase, and not only during the vote. And finally, a national commission, which is independent and made up in truly pluralistic fashion and autonomous. The second group of questions, tangible measures that the international community can envisage to support human rights in Burundi. And 3 measures here. First, direct support to civil society organizations in Burundi working in exile in order to keep documentation and advocacy capacities. Second, mechanisms of the UPR to amplify the recommendations made by treaty bodies. 3, explicit unconditionality of commitment and assistance in order to have measurable criteria. Second group of questions, What action should be a priority to create a suitable environment first? Revision or repeal of restrictive laws applying to organizations. Second, immediate unconditional freeing of human rights defenders and journalists. Third, guarantee of effective access to legal registration for civil society organizations. And finally, effective protection mechanisms for journalistic sources and whistleblowers. Another group of questions is on the publication of the final report. What are the obstacles to that? First, the ongoing refusal of Burundi's authorities to recognize the legitimacy of the mandate of the Commission and its conclusions. Second, the challenge to the independence of the judiciary and the criminal responsibility of perpetrators, the need for effective impartiality. Third, non-cooperation with the International Criminal Court. Fourth, the closure of space for victims and civil society. And fifth, last but not least, the institutions of a body with a specific follow-up mandate. There's a gap. And last group of questions. How can the international community help Burundi to preserve civil liberties and democracy? On the electoral level, one could have electoral observer missions from the pre-electoral phase. Second, ensure that the mechanism explicitly reflect the human rights dimension in approaches to stabilization, prevent the instrumentalization of the border crisis, and institutionally maintain a multilateral visible presence, reopening the necessary spaces and building the capacities of the Independent National Human Rights Commission through the relevant technical commissions to guarantee independence. I thank you.
Muchas gracias.
Thank you very much indeed. This wraps up this international interactive dialogue. I wish to thank Mr. Gaetan Zonga for his participation. We will now take a brief technical break before proceeding with the interactive dialogue with the Special Rapporteur on the human rights situation in Belarus.
Comenzaremos ahora el diálogo.
We will now hold the interactive dialogue with a special rapporteur on the human rights situation in Belarus. Let me welcome the mandate holder, Mr. Muiznieks. The list of speakers will close in 15 minutes. And now give the floor to Mr. Muiznieks for him to present his report.
Esteemed Vice President, Excellencies, distinguished delegates, ladies and gentlemen, it's my great honor to transmit for the consideration of the Human Rights Council my second report, which provides an overview of human rights developments in Belarus from 1 April 2025 through 31 March 2026. Now, the report also focuses in on cultural rights, and I'll explain why in a few minutes. As you have all received the report, I will not dwell on it very long. I'll try to be brief so that I can devote more time to addressing your questions and concerns. The period in question saw the early release of more than 400 political prisoners. However, until recently, releases were followed by expulsions from the country and frequent cancellations of passports and other identity documents. More recent releases have seen some people able to remain in Belarus, though they often continue to face ongoing pressure, surveillance, professional restrictions, and many are even barred from having bank accounts or SIM cards for their telephones. I continue to receive regular reports from those released of torture, ill treatment, inadequate conditions of detention, lack of access to urgent medical care, and insufficient or poor quality food, which you can see by the emaciated look of people who are released. I'm only able to conclude that torture and ill treatment are state policy in Belarus. Overall, repression has continued unabated, with the number of political prisoners remaining largely stable. And this is because at the same time that you have releases, you have intensified targeting of others. And these others include supporters of Ukraine, media workers, book publishers, religious activists, and LGBTI persons. Moreover, the reporting period saw a sharp increase in materials designated arbitrarily as being extremist, which has created increased human rights risks for people seeking to receive or impart information. It has also served to stifle free expression in the country even more. I decided to focus in on cultural rights in this report for several reasons. The topic has been largely neglected by other human rights mechanisms, but I think it's important because it is what makes Belarus Belarusian. It is what makes Belarus distinctive. Cultural repression has a long-term impact as language, memory, and cultural production, which is repressed today, cannot easily be transmitted to future generations. The field of culture also reflects larger geopolitical trends as it mirrors the growing influence of Russia in Belarus and state-sponsored anti-Western narratives. Now, in preparing the report, I consulted with my colleague, the UN Special Rapporteur on Cultural Rights, to make sure that my approach aligned with hers. And her reports frequently focus on participation in cultural life without discrimination, diversity, and memorialization practices. Now, people's participation in cultural life in Belarus is severely curtailed and subject to frequent discrimination on political or linguistic grounds. Much of Belarus's natural, ethnic, religious, and other diversity has been displaced by a stultifying homogeneity and uniformity. The authorities have also facilitated the growing role of the Russian language and Russo-Soviet historical narratives. Indeed, use of the Belarusian language is often treated as a sign of political disloyalty. In the realm of education, the authorities have increasingly promoted militarization, which also mirrors developments in Russia. Now, a large number of cultural figures have been targeted in the broader wave of repression, which has swept over Belarus since 2020. This includes actors, artists, writers, book publishers, journalists, scholars, especially scholars of history, heritage and language activists, and ethnic and religious minority figures. I would particularly highlight the targeting of Polish and Lithuanian minority activists, restrictions on native language educational opportunities, and heightened control on cross-border cultural contacts. In addition, Catholic and Protestant clergy and activists have been specially targeted. All these points and more are elaborated upon in the report, but I will stop now. I'm eager to hear your questions and to address them as best I can. Thank you.
Muchas gracias.
Thank you very much. According to practice, we shall start by hearing the delegation of the country concerned by the report. I now give the floor to the distinguished representative of Belarus.
Veo que no se encuentra.
They are not in the room. I now invite interested delegations to ask questions to the Special Rapporteur and to make comments on his report. The speaking time is 1 minute, 30 seconds for all. I'd like to recall that the duration of interactive dialogues is 1 hour and 30 minutes. However, if time permits, additional delegations will be able to speak. I now give the floor to the distinguished representative of the Kingdom of the Netherlands on behalf of a group of countries.
Thank you, Mr. Vice President. And I'm honored to deliver this statement on behalf of the Benelux, Belgium, Luxembourg, and my country, the Kingdom of the Netherlands. And we align ourselves with the EU statement and strongly condemn the appalling pattern of human rights violations in Belarus. While we welcome the release of a number of political prisoners, these releases are overshadowed by the revolving door pattern of repression, which demonstrate that there in fact has been no structural improvement in the human rights situation. And we are furthermore appalled by persistent reports of severe ill treatment in detention and strongly reiterate our call for the immediate and unconditional release of all political prisoners. We are equally alarmed at the continued deterioration of an already severely restricted civic space, with increasing pressure on civil society, independent media, and human rights defenders. The systemic misuse of legislation to criminalize peaceful civic engagement, cultural expression, and independent journalism is unacceptable. So, Vice President, all these actions are fundamentally incompatible with Belarus's obligations under international human rights law, and those responsible for serious human rights violations and abuses must be held accountable. The Benelux countries remain committed to supporting international efforts aimed at documenting violations, preserving evidence, and combating impunity. And Special Rapporteur, what opportunities exist for the international communities to strengthen accountability efforts and support Belarusian civil society, both inside and outside the country?
Muchas gracias.
Thank you. I give the floor to the distinguished representative of the European Union.
Mr. Vice President, the EU thanks the Special Rapporteur for his report and strongly condemns ongoing gross, systematic and widespread human rights violations in Belarus. Politically motivated repression, a completely closed civic space, severe ill treatment in detention, transnational repression, misuse of anti-terrorism and anti-extremism legislation are among violations documented by the independent mechanisms. The EU raises concern about the appalling detention conditions, including physical punishments after suicide attempts or denial of essential medical care. We note the recent release of some political prisoners while expressing concern about new arrests and re-arrests and restrictions on the rights and freedoms of those released. We continue to urge for the immediate and unconditional release of all political prisoners. The EU urges the Belarusian authorities to stop their involvement in Russia's war of aggression against Ukraine, to halt their instrumentalization of migrants, and to immediately ensure the safe return to Ukraine of all unlawfully deported Ukrainian children. Mr. Vice President, the report highlights violations of cultural rights through targeted repression and coercive restructuring of cultural space, education, language use, and historical narratives. The EU remains concerned about intimidation campaigns against all segments of Belarusian society, including cultural figures. Special Rapporteur, how can the international community further contribute to efforts to document these violations and hold authorities accountable? Thank you.
Muchas gracias.
Thank you very much. I now give the floor to the distinguished representative of Denmark on behalf of a group of countries.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. President. I have the honor to speak on behalf of the Nordic Baltic states. We thank the Special Rapporteur for his report, which confirms that Belarus continues to systematically violate human rights and perpetrate total suppression of freedoms of expression, peaceful assembly, and association. 850 political prisoners remain detained, while politically motivated arrests continue. The release of prisoners should never be accompanied by coercion, exile, or further punishment. We deplore the use of torture, coercive psychiatric treatment, arbitrary detention, and transnational repression to suppress dissent beyond Belarus's border. Repression targeting supporters of Ukraine raises serious concern. We condemn Belarus's transnational repression of Vilnius-based European humanitarian university students and their families in Belarus. We urge Belarus to immediately release all political prisoners and end all forms of repression. We strongly condemn the marginalization of the Belarusian language and discrimination of LGBTI plus persons and minority communities, including Polish and Lithuanian minorities, which reflects a broader effort to eliminate pluralism and consolidate ideological control. Mr. Rapporteur, how should we utilize the tools at our disposal to ensure accountability? And I thank you.
Muchas gracias.
Thank you very much. I give the floor now to the distinguished representative of Albania.
Monsieur le Vice-Président, l'Albanie.
Vice President, Albania thanks the Special Rapporteur for the detailed report. We remain deeply concerned at the ongoing systematic violations of human rights in the country. Information bearing witness to arbitrary detentions, ill treatment, and ongoing restrictions of freedom of expression, assembly, and peaceful association and peaceful assembly prove deteriorating civic space. The report also highlights the concerns regarding detention conditions, and we take note of the release of various political prisoners throughout the year. However, as I said, these measures are not necessarily a sign of structural improvement in the human rights situation. We are also concerned at the recent adoption of legislative measures likely to strengthen discrimination against LGBTQI plus persons. We call on the Belarusian authorities to fully respect their international human rights obligations, to put an end to acts of repression against dissenters, to ensure access to medical care for all detainees, and to constructively cooperate with the United Nations mechanisms. Lastly, we strongly reiterate our solidarity with the Belarusian people in their quest for justice, dignity, the rule of law, and respect for fundamental rights. Thank you very much indeed.
Muchas gracias.
Thank you very much. I give the floor to the distinguished representative of Czechia.
Muchas gracias, señor.
Thank you, sir.
The Czech Republic aligns itself with the EU statement. We thank the Special Rapporteur for his comprehensive report. We welcome the release of a number of political prisoners. However, many releases were accompanied by forced expulsion, denial of identity documents, and continued restriction. At the same time, systematic repression persists. Arbitrary arrests, politically motivated convictions, and misuse of anti-extremism and counter-terrorism laws continue to target journalists, human rights defenders, cultural actors, and ordinary citizens, with many still detained, including journalist Ayer Ilyas. We are alarmed by reports of torture, ill treatment, inhuman prison conditions, denial of medical care, and death of custody. We also note with grave concern intensified transnational repression and systematic coercion and blackmail of family members of exiled former political prisoners, a deliberate strategy to silence dissent abroad. We call on Belarus to release all political prisoners, end repressions, and cooperate fully with UN mechanisms. What concrete steps should the international community urgently take to ensure accountability for perpetrators and effectively protect victims, including those in exile and their family members who remain in Belarus? Thank you.
Muchas gracias.
Thank you very much. And I give the floor to the distinguished representative of Poland.
Thank you, Mr. Vice President. Poland aligns itself with the statement of the European Union. Mr. Special Rapporteur, your report demonstrates that the ongoing linguistic and cultural Russification of Belarus goes hand in hand with the rewriting of history and whitewashing of Soviet-era crimes. As the use of the Belarusian language is associated with opposition to the regime, speakers of Belarusian face stigmatization and persecution. The repression has forced many Belarusian artists and cultural figures into exile. Since 2020, vibrant Belarusian artistic communities have emerged in Polish cities. Poland continues to support Belarusian culture in exile, as well as Belarusian language media, including TV Bielsat. Mr. Special Rapporteur, Poland strongly condemns the regime's targeting of minority communities as part of an effort to eradicate pluralism. We are concerned by the persecution of the Polish minority, including the dissolution of its organizations, restrictions on cultural and educational activities, the prosecution of community leaders, and limitations of the teaching of the Polish language. We thank the Special Rapporteur for his important work, drawing attention to the human rights situation in Belarus. I thank you.
Muchas gracias.
Thank you very much. I now give the floor to the distinguished representative of the Republic of Moldova.
Thank you, Mr. Vice President. We thank the Special Rapporteur for presenting the report. The findings confirm once again the human rights violations continue. Freedom of expression, opinion, association, and assembly continue to be under pressure, including through the misuse of anti-extremism and counter-terrorism laws. Restrictions are being imposed on academic freedom, and the reports indicate that ill treatment and torture in prisons persist. We are further worried by the reported repression against Belarusian culture and artistic communities. We welcome recent examples of releasing political detainees, including 250 detainees released in March this year. We encourage the continuation of these efforts, as many detained on political grounds are still behind the bars. We are concerned by finding that public access to independent information on the death penalty is restricted, and that campaign materials against the death penalty are labeled extremist. We reiterate our appeal to the Belarusian authorities to put a moratorium on capital punishment with a view of abolishing it. Mr. President, we also use this opportunity to reiterate our call to Belarus to stop any support to Russia's unprovoked and illegal war of aggression against Ukraine. I thank you.
Muchas gracias.
Thank you very much. I give the floor to the distinguished representative of the Council of Europe.
Mr. Vice President, we thank the Special Rapporteur for his report. We note with relief consecutive releases of political prisoners. However, this cannot negate the fact that they were unjustly imprisoned for exercising their freedoms and were subject to ill treatment and abuses while in detention facilities. The significant number of those who remain behind bars attest to the widespread and systematic repressions. The position of the Council of Europe has been clear. All remaining political prisoners in Belarus must be immediately and unconditionally released. A situation where political and civil activists in prison can serve as hostages is unacceptable. We remain deeply concerned about the intensification of transnational repressions by the Belarusian authorities and deplore the designation of the European Humanities University as extremist. This is just one example of the misuse of the anti-extremist legislation, in addition to many other cases outlined by the Special Rapporteur. While Belarus is not a member state of the Council of Europe, our organization is committed to supporting those who aspire to universal human rights, starting with the abolition of that penalty, which has no place in Europe. Our engagement with representatives of Belarusian democratic forces, civil society, media, and youth continues in the framework of the Contact Group on cooperation with Belarusian democratic forces and civil society. The Council of Europe Information Point for Belarusian people was inaugurated last month in Vilnius. It will raise further awareness and bring our work on human rights closer to Belarusians. Thank you.
Muchas gracias.
Thank you very much. I give the floor to the distinguished representative of Bulgaria.
Mr. Vice President, Bulgaria aligns itself with the EU statement and welcomes the report of the Special Rapporteur. We remain seriously concerned that the human rights situation in Belarus has further deteriorated, affecting both Belarusian citizens in the country and in exile. Bulgaria is worried about the repressive measures in Belarus and continuing ill treatment in detention centers, deprivation of liberty of politically motivated grounds, violation of the freedom of expression and media freedom, violation of freedom of assembly and association. situation. We express concerns about the low access to information as well as lack of transparency in judicial proceedings. There are strong indications about violations of cultural rights leading to the suppression of historical memory, the obstruction of initiatives related to the Belarusian language, increasing ideologization of education, and language-based restrictions on access to the administration and the judicial system. We call on the Belarusian authorities to remove restrictions on the exercise of the rights of freedom of peaceful assembly, cease the excessive use of force against peaceful demonstrations, stop arbitrary arrests, detentions, and imprisonment, take measures to prevent torture and other cruel, inhuman, or degrading treatment or punishment, guarantee unhindered exercise of cultural rights, and apply internationally recognized standards for academic freedom. Bulgaria denounces the Belarus role in supporting and being complicit in Russia's military aggression against Ukraine and calls on the Belarusian authorities to comply with the internationally recognized obligations of the country in conformity with.
Thank you very much. I give the floor to the Distinguished Representative of Germany.
Thank you, Mr. Vice President. Germany aligns itself with the EU statement. We thank the Special Rapporteur for his tireless work and regret the Belarusian government's lack of engagement with the mandate. We condemn the continuous systemic and widespread crackdown on human rights and civil society by Belarusian authorities and the escalating levels of persecution of minorities, political opponents, and those opposing the Russian war against Ukraine. There is no safe place for public life in Belarus anymore. Even cultural life has become a minefield of censorship, coercion, and arbitrary detention of actors, artists, musicians, writers, publishers, scholars, and students. But the repression doesn't stop at the borders. Many Belarusians in exile are subjected to transnational repression, such as denial of consular services, in absentia trials, property seizures, and pressure on family and friends remaining in Belarus. We welcome the release of some political prisoners, but many of them are forced into exile without identity documents, while those allowed to stay in Belarus continue experience restrictions. We are also deeply worried about those who are still detained under inhumane conditions and those subjected to violence, arbitrary arrests, and show trials in Belarus, simply for standing up for their human rights and freedoms. Mr. Special Rapporteur, how can we support the Belarusian people in the realization, fulfillment, and enjoyment of their human rights? Thank you.
Muchas gracias.
Thank you very much. I give the floor to the Distinguished Representative of Slovenia.
Mr. Vice President, Slovenia aligns with the statement of the European Union. We thank the Special Rapporteur for his comprehensive report. Once again, you have documented systematic and gross violations of human rights. Despite the recent releases of political prisoners, politically motivated repression in Belarus persists. We are gravely alarmed by the ongoing torture and ill treatment in detention facilities, the ongoing trend of forcible expulsion and the transnational repression through trials in absentia, as well as indefinite extension of the deprivation of liberty for individuals convicted on politically motivated charges. Targeting of minorities and the cultural figures continues. We condemn the documented harassment of families as the degrading and abuses faced by women and older persons in detention. We call on Belarus to immediately end these practices, release all those detained on political grounds. I thank you.
Muchas gracias.
Thank you very much. The list of speakers is now closed. I give the floor to the Distinguished Representative of Australia.
Thank you, Vice President. Australia thanks the Special Rapporteur for his report. Australia remains deeply concerned that advocates for democracy, opponents of the war, and marginalised groups continue to face repression in Belarus, with thousands reportedly tortured, forced into exile, or arbitrarily detained for exercising their rights to freedom of opinion, expression, and association. We are alarmed by the report's findings that Belarus's new laws target women's rights advocates, LGBTQIA+ persons, and independent voices, including individuals facilitating access to human rights mechanisms. These laws entrench stigma and legitimize discrimination against groups already unjustly detained and arbitrarily targeted by the Belarusian government. Australia also deplores Belarus's role in aiding and abetting Russia's invasion of Ukraine. Belarus's continued complicity prolongs the conflict and fuels Russia's ongoing aggression. We reiterate our calls to Belarus to comply with its international human rights obligations. Special Rapporteur, what actions can the international community take to encourage Belarus to end its repressive practices, including repealing provisions of the Code of Administrative Offences? Thank you.
Muchas gracias.
Thank you very much. I now give the floor to the Distinguished Representative of Ukraine.
Mr. President, Ukraine thanks the Special Rapporteur for his comprehensive report and unwavering commitment to monitor and document the human rights situation in Belarus. This report confirms that the Belarusian authorities continue to engage in systematic repression, including arbitrary detention, politically motivated prosecutions, torture and ill treatment, restrictions on fundamental freedoms, and transnational persecution of dissidents. Ukraine remains deeply concerned by the continued detention of hundreds of political prisoners and by reports of forced expulsions, harassment of family members, and the misuse of anti-extremism and counter-terrorism legislation to human rights situation. Repression continues in the form of persecution of former detainees and their family members. We call on the Belarusian authorities to immediately and unconditionally release all political prisoners and repression against civil society and fully cooperate with United Nations human rights mechanisms. Mr. Special Rapporteur, what additional steps should the international community take to strengthen protection for Belarusian civil society and ensure accountability for ongoing human rights violations? Thank you.
Muchas gracias.
Thank you. I call on North Macedonia.
Mr. Vice President, we thank the Special Rapporteur for the presentation of his report. We remain deeply concerned by the continued deterioration of the human rights situation in Belarus. Despite the release of some political prisoners, the report makes clear that politically motivated repression remains widespread. Political opponents, journalists, human rights defenders, lawyers continue to face arbitrary detention, unfair trials, and restrictions on the exercise of their fundamental freedoms. The report also indicates that the rights of freedom of assembly and association in Belarus remain nearly non-existent. We are particularly concerned by reports of torture and inhuman detention conditions, including prolonged solitary confinement and limited access to medical care, as well as continued use of anti-extremism and counter-terrorism legislation to restrict civil society's activism. We also note the report's finding on transnational repression, including trials in absentia, intimidation of family members, and pressure of independent civil society beyond Belarus borders. We call on Belarus to comply with its international human rights obligations and politically motivated repression, release all those arbitrarily detained, and cooperate fully with UN human rights mechanisms, including the Special Rapporteur. Muchas gracias, Mr. President.
Muchas gracias.
Thank you. I call on Austria.
Thank you, Mr. Vice President. Austria aligns with the EU statement and thanks the Special Rapporteur for his report. While we acknowledge negotiated releases of some individuals identified as political prisoners, Austria remains concerned by the ongoing repression of those who have been released, including the transnational repression of those who have been expelled. We are deeply concerned about the remaining political prisoners detained in appalling conditions, some held incommunicado for several years, as well as reports of new arrests for the peaceful exercise of human rights and retaliation against families and supporters of detainees. We therefore urge Belarus to immediately and unconditionally release and rehabilitate all those unlawfully or arbitrarily detained, including human rights defenders, trade unionists, journalists, media workers, and lawyers. Austria reiterates its call for Belarus to respect, protect, fulfill human rights in compliance with its obligations under international human rights law and to cooperate with the Special Rapporteur and all relevant human rights mechanisms and investigations. Special Rapporteur, Your report addresses the difficult situation of national, ethnic, linguistic, and religious minorities in Belarus. Could you elaborate further on the impact of increased targeting and stigmatizations of persons belonging to minorities? Thank you.
Muchas gracias.
Thank you. I call on Montenegro.
President, we thank the Special Rapporteur for the well-substantiated report. The human rights situation in Belarus continues to deteriorate. As outlined by the Special Rapporteur, freedoms of expression, peaceful assembly, and association remain severely restricted. Independent media, civil society actors, and political opponents continue to face persecution, including through the misuse of counterterrorism and anti-extremism legislation. Reports of ill treatment, inattention, and patterns of transnational repression are also deeply concerning. We welcome the recent release of a number of political prisoners. However, this is overshadowed by reports of new arrests and rearrests, as well as ongoing restrictions of those released. We urge the Belarusian authorities to immediately and unconditionally release all remaining political prisoners and to ensure their rehabilitation in line with international human rights standards. We are also concerned by the erosion of cultural rights, including intimidation of cultural figures, restrictions on cultural activity, discrimination against Belarusian language speakers, and repression of historical memory and national symbols, as well as impacts on ethnic and religious minorities. We are deeply disappointed that Belarus is the only one remaining state in Europe that still applies the death penalty. We urge Belarus to refrain from any actions facilitating Russia's war of aggression against Ukraine. As a member of the International Coalition for the Return of Ukrainian Children, we urge the safe return of all Ukrainian children unlawfully deported or forcibly transferred. Thank you, Mr. Vice President.
Muchas gracias.
Thank you. I call on France. Thank you, Vice President. Special Rapporteur France condemns the ongoing repression by the authorities of Belarus against all elements of civil society. We welcome the courage of all those who uphold fundamental rights and freedoms in the face of repression. We thank you for your work, shedding light on arbitrary detentions and inhuman conditions, documenting the violations of fundamental freedoms, freedom of opinion, association, freedom of peaceful assembly, and transnational repression. The report also sheds light on the extent of repression on the cultural, linguistic, and media spheres. This so-called combating of extremism leads to unacceptable conditions. There must be free expression of opposing opinions. We condemn the violence of the rights of LGBTI persons and the violations against them. We wish to combat impunity and document violations. We support the Special Rapporteur on the human rights situation in the country and the expert mechanism. I thank you.
Muchas gracias.
Thank you. I call on Malta.
Thank you, Mr. Vice President. Malta aligns itself with the EU statement and thanks the Special Rapporteur for his comprehensive report. We remain concerned by the persistent pattern of politically motivated repression, including arbitrary detention, torture, and ill treatment, and the systematic curtailment of freedoms of expression, association, and peaceful assembly. The near total dismantling of independent civil society and media, alongside the institutional misuse of counterterrorism and anti-extremism legislation, further entrenches a climate of fear and impunity. Malta welcomes the recent release of some individuals recognized as political prisoners. Nevertheless, we reiterate our call for the immediate and unconditional release of all those who remain arbitrarily detained on political grounds. We share the SR's concern regarding the conditions of detention, including reports of inhuman treatment and denial of medical care. We urge the Belarusian authorities to fully cooperate with international human rights mechanisms and to take immediate steps to restore these rights and engage in an inclusive national dialogue. Finally, we call on Belarus to abolish the death penalty and, as a first step, establish a moratorium. Thank you.
Muchas gracias.
Thank you. I call on Cyprus.
Vice President, Cyprus aligns itself with the EU statement and commends the Special Rapporteur's work. The report confirms that Belarus continues to systematically and grossly violate the international human rights obligations through ongoing politically motivated repression and a complete crackdown on freedom of expression, assembly, and association. We are deeply alarmed by the findings presented, such as severe and widespread ill treatment and detention, including for women and persons with disabilities, the misuse of counterterrorism and extremism legislation to criminalize dissent, including against journalists and academics, the coercive psychiatric treatment used as a tool of repression, and the targeted repression of cultural and linguistic identity. We also note with grave concern the decision of the ICC Office of the Prosecutor to open a formal investigation into alleged crimes against humanity committed by Belarusian authorities since 2020. This underscores the urgent need for accountability. While we welcome the release of some political prisoners, we remain concerned about new arrests and call on Belarus to release all political prisoners and fully cooperate with the UN human rights mechanisms. Mr. Special Rapporteur, what can the international community do to support Belarusian citizens to bring an end to the Belarusian authorities' systemic violation of human rights? I thank you.
Muchas gracias.
Thank you. I call on Croatia.
Mr. Vice President, Croatia aligns itself with the EU statement. We thank the Special Rapporteur for his report, which shows that Belarusian authorities continue its politically motivated repression. Croatia strongly condemns the widespread violations of human rights, especially since the 2020 fraudulent presidential elections and the complete crackdown on freedom of expression, assembly, and association. We call for the unconditional and immediate release of all political prisoners and arbitrarily detained persons. While we note the release of some political prisoners in March this year, we strongly condemn the ongoing persecution of those released, as well as political opponents, media workers, and minority communities. We also regret the violations of cultural rights and the attempts at reshaping historical memory as a part of a broader policy aimed at controlling the expression of cultural and national identity. We support the Special Rapporteur's call to end the labeling of peaceful cultural, artistic, and religious activity as extremist. We particularly call for an education free from ideologization. Croatia reiterates its support for the people of Belarus and for full respect for human rights and fundamental freedoms. Thank you.
Muchas gracias.
Thank you. I call on Romania.
Thank you, Vice President. Romania aligns itself with the EU statement and thanks the Special Rapporteur for his report. The human rights situation in Belarus continues to be deeply concerning. While the recent release of several political prisoners is a positive step, politically motivated repression continues, including through the misuse of anti-extremism and anti-terrorism legislation against human rights defenders, civil society representatives, journalists, and other dissenting voices. Also concerning are the severe restrictions on the freedoms of expression, peaceful assembly and association, as well as by the continued repression of cultural rights, including censorship of artists, writers, and cultural workers, increasing restriction on the use of the Belarusian language in education, media and publishing, and attempts to reshape history and national identity. Romania calls on the authorities of Belarus to end politically motivated persecution and release all remaining political prisoners. Once again, Romania reiterates its call on Belarus to engage meaningfully with all international human rights mechanisms and to cease its refusal to cooperate with the mandate of the Special Rapporteur. Special Rapporteur, given the increasing ideological and militarized nature of education in Belarus that the report highlights, how can this forum and the UN human rights mechanisms better support the protection of the right to education and academic freedom in this context? I thank you.
Muchas gracias. Cedo la palabra.
Thank you. I call on Armenia.
Thank you, Mr. Vice President. Armenia takes note of the report presented by the Special Rapporteur. We hope that signing of the United Nations Sustainable Development Cooperation Framework for Belarus for 2026-2030 and inclusion of human rights-related areas of cooperation in it will facilitate much-needed progress for the rule of law and democratic governance in Belarus. Armenia notes the release of hundreds of detained persons. At the same time, we are concerned by the serious allegations of arrests and other forms of deprivation of liberty, such as coercive psychiatric treatment, where there are grounds to believe that those actions may be politically motivated. We stress that adequate legal protection must be ensured for all detained persons, and all allegations of torture and ill treatment must be investigated. We are also convinced that silencing dissent and penalizing legitimate free speech not only violates political and cultural rights, but will also hinder wider societal dialogue and cohesion in Belarus. Mr. Vice President, we stated that previously we would like to repeat. Armenia greatly values strong historical ties between our peoples and societies. We are genuinely interested in the strengthening of democratic institutions in Belarus based on respect for human rights and fundamental freedoms. I thank you.
Muchas gracias.
Thank you. I call on Greece.
Thank you, Mr. Vice President. Greece aligns itself with the EU statement and thanks the Special Rapporteur for his report. Belarus' continued involvement in Russia's war of aggression against Ukraine and the instrumentalization of migrants for political purposes remain integral elements of the Belarusian authorities' conduct and require the sustained vigilance and resolute response of the international community. We are particularly concerned, as you mentioned, by the reported state-driven rewriting of history, the militarization of education, the suppression of Belarusian language initiatives, the persecution of publishers, scholars, and journalists, as well as the repression of ethnic and religious minorities, not only contribute to a climate of fear, but also appear aimed at instilling state ideology in younger generations. Greece reiterates its call for the immediate and unconditional release of all political prisoners and urges the Belarusian authorities to repeal legislation and policies that unduly restrict fundamental freedoms and cultural diversity. Special Rapporteur, in the report, you recall that the memorialization processes play a crucial role in shaping collective identity. Could you elaborate on any examples of good practices that could restore respect for cultural diversity in Belarus? Thank you.
Muchas gracias.
Thank you. I call on the UK.
Mr. Vice President, the UK thanks the Special Rapporteur for his report, and we remain deeply concerned by the continued deterioration of the human rights situation in Belarus. We are particularly troubled by the sustained use of arbitrary detention, the targeting of journalists and civil society, and the ongoing repression of those exercising their fundamental freedoms. Reports from organisations such as Viasna, alongside other trusted sources, continue to highlight ill treatment in detention and the systemic absence of due process. The Belarusian authorities' persistent refusal to engage with UN mechanisms, including the mandate of this Special Rapporteur, further demonstrates their disregard for international obligations. The UK continues to support accountability efforts, including through multilateral initiatives, and to stand with Belarusian civil society, both inside the country and in exile. We will continue to work with partners to ensure that violations are documented and that those responsible are held to account. We remain concerned by the broader climate of fear and the increasing pressure on independent voices, including through legislative measures designed to restrict dissent. Special Rapporteur, how has the Belarusians' approach to cultural repression changed since the 2020 protests? Thank you.
Muchas gracias.
Thank you. I call on Ireland.
Thank you. Ireland aligns with the statement of the EU and thanks the Special Rapporteur for his update. Ireland stands in solidarity with the Belarusian people and remains extremely concerned at the Belarusian authorities' continued systematic violations of its human rights obligations. The authorities continue their persecution of human rights defenders, journalists, trade unionists, media workers, lawyers, and ordinary citizens who voice criticism of the government. This persecution has been characterized by severe restrictions on the rights to freedom of association, peaceful assembly, opinion, and expression. We condemn the Belarusian authorities' misuse of counter-terrorism and anti-extremism legislation to arrest and detain individuals on politically motivated grounds, and the continued targeting of individuals following their release by being placed on extremist or terrorist lists. We further condemn the introduction of discriminatory legislation against LGBTIQ+ persons. Ireland deplores the Belarusian authorities' appalling mistreatment of prisoners, including reports of incommunicado detention and prolonged solitary confinement, and reiterates its call for the immediate, unconditional release of all political prisoners. Ireland further condemns the authorities' politicisation, marginalisation, and repression of the Belarusian people's cultural identity, including the Belarusian language. This undermines not only the enjoyment of individual rights, but also the cultural heritage of the Belarusian people. Special Rapporteur, What steps can the international community take to help the Belarusian people protect their cultural heritage? Thank you.
Muchas gracias.
Thank you. I call on Switzerland. Thank you, Vice President. Switzerland thanks the Special Rapporteur for his report. Switzerland remains deeply concerned at the human rights situation in Belarus. While the recent release of several arbitrarily detained persons is a positive development, it should not obscure the persistence of systematic repression. At least 850 people remain arbitrarily deprived of their liberty, while others continue to be prosecuted and sentenced for exercising their rights. The report also highlights that those released who remain in Belarus are likely to still face restrictions and surveillance, while others have been forcibly deported, sometimes without valid documents or any meaningful possibility of remaining in Belarus. We're also concerned at the misuse of legislation on extremism and terrorism, which has led to many arbitrary arrests. Switzerland calls on Belarus to release all those arbitrarily detained, to put an end to repression, including the misuse of legislation on extremism and terrorism, and to guarantee the effective exercise of civil and political rights in accordance with its international obligations. Mr. Special Rapporteur, how can the international community support the released persons who remain in Belarus and continue to face the risk of further prosecution? Thank you.
Muchas gracias.
Thank you. We will now move to the list of speakers for national human rights institutions and non-governmental organizations. And I call on the National Human Rights Civic Association Belarusian Helsinki Committee.
Distinguished President, Excellencies, colleagues, at least 800 political prisoners remain behind bars in Belarus, with new cases initiated daily. Moreover, the Belarusian authorities continue to expand transnational repression against citizens forced into exile. They face intimidation and pressure abroad, while their relatives in Belarus are subjected to interrogations and threats from KGB. Measures initially presented as targeting political opponents increasingly produce broader societal consequences, affecting many individuals with no political background. The authorities appear increasingly willing to accept this kind of collateral damage as byproduct of their policies. At the same time, the principle of collective responsibility is increasingly applied to relatives of those labeled as political, including through dismissals and other forms of pressure. The authorities also continue to expand the abuse of anti-extremism legislation, including by designating as extremist formations alongside many human rights organizations. At the same time, repression continues to be formalized through law. Particularly alarming is the introduction of administrative liability for so-called LGBTQ propaganda. Against this backdrop, the recent releases of political prisoners should not be interpreted as evidence of genuine improvement. Thank you.
Muchas gracias.
Thank you. I call on the Law Society.
Mr. President, the Law Society of England and Wales and Lawyers' Rights Watch Canada thank the Special Rapporteur on Belarus for their important work. We remain gravely concerned about the situation facing the legal profession in Belarus, characterized by the sustained repression of lawyers, erosion of judicial independence, and arbitrary interference by the Ministry of Justice in licensing and disciplinary proceedings. This repression has sharply reduced the number of practicing lawyers, as many have been silenced, disbarred, imprisoned, or forced into exile. 6 lawyers remain behind bars simply for doing their job. Such reprisals extend beyond individual cases, contributing to systemic violations of fair trial rights and the rule of law, and severely undermining access to justice for everyone in Belarus. They also violate international standards, including the UN Basic Principles on the rule of lawyers. For those lawyers forced into exile, their repression does not stop at the border. They face significant barriers to continuing their legal careers and rebuilding their lives. They must also endure the psychological impact of displacement and separation from family and friends. In addition, lawyers in exile frequently face transnational repression, while their relatives in Belarus continue to be harassed. We urge the Special Rapporteur to continue advocating for an end to reprisals against lawyers and their families, the release of all those detained for legitimate professional work, and an end to state interference in the judiciary and bar associations. We ask the Special Rapporteur to monitor the state practice of forcing Belarusian lawyers into exile and advocate for an end to this practice. allowing Belarusian lawyers to continue their careers without fear of intimidation or harassment. Thank you.
Muchas gracias.
Thank you. I call on the International Bar Association.
The International Bar Association's Human Rights Institute and the International Commission of Juries condemn the ongoing repression of civil society in Belarus, in particular systematic attacks and judicial harassment against lawyers representing dissenting voices and defending human rights and the rule of law. We deplore the subordination of the judiciary to the executive control and the Ministry of Justice interference in the independent governance of the legal profession, including lawyers' licensing and disciplinary proceedings, and the Bar Association's failure to protect its members. Effective remedies for impacted lawyers are not available. Since 2020, at least 600 lawyers have been forced to leave the profession through arbitrary disbarment, prosecution, fear of persecution, with several imprisoned and many forced into exile. We denounce systematic repression of Belarusian residing abroad, including trials in absentia against exiled activists and the denial of access to essential consular services, placing many at risk of statelessness and other serious human rights violations. We call on host states to protect and support lawyers in exile through all appropriate measures, including facilitating access to legal employment. We urge Belarus to immediately and unconditionally release all those arbitrarily detained, including lawyers, and seize all acts of persecution and reprisals, including targeting persons abroad. Ensure prompt, thorough, independent, and impartial investigations into these violations with a view to ensuring full accountability. Thank you.
Muchas gracias.
Thank you. I call on War Resisters International.
UNHRC, together with its partner Connection EV, thanks the Special Rapporteur for his report and expresses its concern for the worsening of the situation of human rights in Belarus. The ongoing trend of the transnational repression through trials in absentia has been also reported by the group of independent experts. We recall, for instance, Olga Karach, who has already received a first sentence in absentia, together with several other human rights defenders. Transnational repression is affecting many human rights defenders seeking protection abroad. We have been notified, for instance, that debanking remains a serious problem for Belarusian human rights defenders and civil society organizations like Our House in Lithuania. We are concerned for conscientious objectors to military service persecuted in Belarus. The right to conscientious objection to military service is inherent in the right to freedom of thought, conscience, and religion. And in the country, there is still not a full implementation of this right. And many objectors are forced to leave the country and, lamentably, are often denied protection in other countries and are at risk of being deported back to Belarus, where they can face criminal prosecution, torture, and long-term imprisonment. We call on member states to grant asylum to Belarusian conscientious objectors and human rights defenders who seek protection abroad in line with UNHRC guidelines on international protection. It is also alarming the ongoing militarization of children who are sent to military units and military patriotic camps. We have been notified of mobilization exercises announced in the Grodno region. We call on Belarus to align with international standards.
Muchas gracias.
Thank you. I call on Conscience and Peace Talks International.
Thank you, Mr. Vice President. Conscience and Peace Talks International welcomes the report of the Special Rapporteur on Belarus. We remain concerned by the structural limitations of the domestic alternative to military service. By restricting eligibility to certified members of a narrow list of religious communities with pacifist doctrines, the current system leaves secular, ethical, philosophical, and other religious conscientious objectors without legal recourse. Furthermore, the duration, being double the length for military service, imposes a disproportionate burden that departs from international standards of non-punitive civilian service. This is compounded by recent administrative measures that condition essential identity documentation upon military compliance certificates. This interlocking framework risks compromising the fundamental civil rights and legal recognition of peaceful objectors. In uncertain times, true societal resilience is enhanced when states provide inclusive and fair, civilian-controlled mechanisms that allow all citizens to contribute constructively to the public interest through essential infrastructure and social welfare. Could the Special Rapporteur elaborate on how the international community can best support Belarus in the establishment of a genuinely non-punitive alternative service that successfully reconciles civic duties with the universal right to freedom of conscience? Thank you.
Muchas gracias. Cedo la
Thank you. I call on Ingenieur Dumond.
Mr. President, distinguished members of the Human Rights Council, dear Special Rapporteur, I thank you for your work and for your continued attention to the human rights situation in Belarus. Today, Belarus appears less frequently in international headlines, but it doesn't mean that repression has diminished. On the contrary, it has become more systematic, more sophisticated, and often less visible to the outside world. As of the end of June 2026, there are still 940 political prisoners in Belarus. What is happening in Belarus has long ceased to be merely an internal crisis or human rights crisis. It has become a broader threat to regional security. The Belarus regime remains one of the key sources of instability on Europe's eastern frontier. This is why the United Nations' attention to Belarus must not weaken. I call on member states to support the renewal and strengthening of the mandate of the Special Rapporteur on the situation of human rights in Belarus. I also call for continued support to the group of independent experts on the human rights situation in Belarus. Their work is essential for documenting violations, preserving evidence, and ensuring future accountability. Furthermore, I encourage the Office of the United Nations High Commissioner for Human Rights to organize a high-level event on Belarus. The voices of victims must continue to be heard within the United Nations system.
Muchas gracias.
Thank you. I call on Human Rights House Foundation.
Thank you, Vice President. The Special Rapporteur's latest report shows that the Belarusian authorities are trying to control the space in which Belarusians remember, speak, study, and create. This is especially clear in attacks on the Belarusian language and independent culture. The designation of PEN Belarus as an extremist formation in February, following the targeting of its website and social media, is part of a wider campaign against cultural and human rights work. PEN Belarus recently reported that at least 125 cultural figures, including at least 24 writers, were imprisoned or under home confinement, and that 357 books had been banned. Vice President, these attacks should be understood alongside the continued imprisonment of those documenting the deterioration of culture and other rights in Belarus. Journalist Andrei Alexandrov, a former deputy chair of the Belarusian Association of Journalists, remains imprisoned, as does journalist Ikar Ilyash. We call on Belarus to release them and all political prisoners, end the persecution of PEN Belarus and other civil society organizations, and revoke extremist designations used to criminalize culture, language, and human rights work. Special Rapporteur, how can states better support Belarusian cultural actors, writers, and human rights defenders who continue their work in exile while protecting those who remain inside the country? I thank you.
Muchas gracias.
Thank you very much. I now give the floor to Lawyers for Lawyers.
The Lawyer for Lawyers welcomes the Special Rapporteur's comprehensive report and supports analysis and recommendations. We deplore the ongoing systematic persecution of lawyers in Belarus who continue to face criminalization, disbarment, and intimidation simply for carrying out their professional duties. The legal profession remains devoid of independence. The Ministry of Justice continues to arbitrarily interfere in licensing and disciplinary proceedings, while the Bar Association operates under state control rather than in defense of its members. While the negotiated release of several individuals identified as political prisoners, including lawyer Maxim Snack, was a welcome development, it is far from signaling systematic change. Mr. Snack's forced departure from the country illustrates the persistent hostility faced by legal professionals. We remain gravely concerned that at least 5 lawyers continue to be held on fabricated charges, reflecting a broader pattern of arbitrary detention and repression. Forced into exile also continue to face intimidation, harassment, and transnational reprisals for eroding what remains of legal independence in Belarus. Such actions violate international standards, including the UN Basic Principles on the role of lawyers. We urge this Council to demand an immediate end to reprisals against Belarusian lawyers and to call to the release of all lawyers detained for their professional work. We further call on all member states to continue supporting the Special Rapporteurs and the group of independent experts in their vital efforts to safeguard the rule of law and human rights in Belarus. Thank you.
Muchas gracias.
Thank you very much. I give the floor to International Federation for Human Rights Leagues.
My name is Valentin Stefanovich. On behalf of Federation Vesna, I'm presenting this statement. We wish to express our deep concern of the continuing political motivated repression in Belarus, which is affecting ever broader groups of citizens. The recent designation of the European Humanities University in Vilnius as extremist formation and subsequent criminal cases is a clear example of this trend. According to incomplete data collected by Vesna, there are currently 850 political prisoners, including women, while the health condition of many of them is a matter of serious concern. The recent releases of some political prisoners, followed by the forced expulsion from the country, cannot be regarded as a sustainable solution of the ongoing human rights crisis. Such forced deportations constitute examples of transnational repression and might amount to crimes against humanity. The practice of torture and other forms of cruel treatment continues, underscoring the urgent need for effective international accountability mechanisms capable of ensuring that those responsible for serious human rights violations are brought to justice. We urge the international community to maintain pressure on the Belarusian authorities, support accountability efforts, and stand with the victims of repression. The release of all political prisoners, the end of repression, and justice for victims must remain non-negotiable demands.
Muchas gracias.
Thank you very much. I give the floor to Shanxi Patriotic Volunteer Association.
Vice President, Special Rapporteur. As the founder of IPO, I uphold the principle that patriotism must not come at the expense of other nations' interests. I wish to express grave concern regarding this report. Para 57 of the report criticizes Belarus' anti-Western narrative, yet overlooks the long-standing containment and sanctions imposed by Western countries on the East. Would not such hostility and interference constitute anti-Eastern stance? This double standard is deeply regrettable. We believe that in the context of sustained Western pressure, Belarus' efforts to strengthen national defense education and military patriotism constitute legitimate defensive measures to the so-called color revolutions. True peace should not be built upon unilateral accusations. To explore how Eastern perspective can benefit resolving geopolitical conflicts, we invite all participants to the IPO Autumn Forum to be held in Yunnan on the 21st September. The theme of the forum is the International Patriotic Pact and the right to national development. The forum will focus on the legitimacy of patriotism as a part of right to development and ways to build a new international order of peace. We welcome for all to uphold the voice of justice.
Muchas gracias.
Thank you very much. That was the last speaker we could accommodate. I now give the floor back to Mr. who's next for him to respond to the questions and comments. You have 10 minutes, sir.
Thank you very much. Until this last intervention, I was almost convinced that there was a consensus in the Human Rights Council about the situation in Belarus. I actually welcome dissenting voices. It's a sign of democracy, and that those who don't agree with me feel free to speak their mind. And I would encourage countries that don't like the work that we're doing to say so and engage with us in a dialogue. And this includes the Belarusian authorities, who unfortunately are not in the room to engage with me again. First of all, I want to agree with the several speakers from the Netherlands, from Ukraine, from Switzerland, who share my assessment that there has been no systematic, structural, or fundamental change in Belarus. And at the end of my response, I will try to indicate what signs of fundamental change might look like. But let me start about the risk of slipping back into a view that sees mass repression as being in some way normal, or and the temptation of going back to business as usual. I think it's been clear there's no going back after all the repression, after the complicity in the war in Ukraine, and the state-sponsored trafficking in human beings towards the EU for political gain. I think that it's clear that there must be change on all of these dimensions. And the best chance for a different Belarus in the future is one that sees that many of the perpetrators are called to justice today. And this leads me to the point about accountability, which was raised by a number of different delegations, Netherlands, EU, Denmark, Czech Republic, Ukraine, UK. Now, my colleagues from the group of independent experts on Belarus and as well as the International Accountability Platform for Belarus have laid out the possible paths to accountability, and I recommend you have a look at their work. These include the International Criminal Court, the International Court of Justice, the ICC investigation into Ukraine, universal jurisdiction, the ILO mechanisms and monitoring, perhaps a new register of damages, similar to the one that was created for Ukraine, as well as a special tribunal for Belarus. As states wait for a window of opportunity in Belarus for things to change fundamentally, I think it's essential to keep gathering evidence, to gather testimony, and to document all manner of violations. This is becoming more difficult because the Belarusian authorities are hiding their tracks much more than before. No longer are data about court cases available on the internet. There's a lot of fear of reprisals, so it's more difficult to gather information on what's going on. We can still do it, but it's becoming more difficult. Regarding, yes, and a number of, and one factor that was mentioned in a number of the interventions, especially by NGOs, was the situation of lawyers, which is very dire, and I completely agree. One aspect of ensuring accountability would be to ensure the freedom of lawyers to do their job within Belarus. Belarus has a lot of great lawyers. They've been repressed, they've been controlled, and for accountability to mean something, you need a lawyer's profession that can call itself that, not only in name, but in fact. Regarding exiles, a number of delegations mentioned exiles. They need your help and support. They need a rapid, flexible, generous and user-friendly approach to their legal status and documentation, especially given the lack of consular services from the Belarusian authorities outside of Belarus. Some, especially released political prisoners, may need psychosocial support for the trauma that they have experienced from torture within detention in Belarus. They also need your protection from transnational repression. Transnational repression goes on in your jurisdictions, not in Belarus, but these are violations that take place and you need to help them, you need to help combat those violations. Politically motivated Interpol red notices, cyber attacks, physical threats, designation of exile, cultural and other initiatives as being extremist, and so on. Exiles need your support in their efforts to maintain and develop the Belarusian language, historical research, cultural production, as well as education. Media initiatives that reach into Belarus need support. I think this is key to maintaining a critically thinking, democratically oriented public, however small and repressed within Belarus. Listen to human rights defenders, give them a platform, consult with them regularly about developments in Belarus, give their organizations funding. There was, yes, a question about the right to education, what more can be done. I think that the key is support educational initiatives in host countries of exiles, follow closely NGO reports on repression of scholars, teachers, and students. Scholars at Risk is a good source. Support online human rights education, which could reach into Belarus. And when change does occur, it is possible to resume normal contacts and cooperation. Educational exchanges should be a priority to get the younger generation exposed to alternative points of view and alternatives to the situation in which they've grown up. Regarding alternative service in Belarus, I think Belarus seems to be going in the opposite direction of liberalizing its alternative service because you have increasing militarization of education, combat readiness training, and so on in universities. There might be a role for the UN, especially the UN country team in the future for this. This could be a topic for a future Belarusian government that wanted to sincerely engage with the international community on human rights reforms. I don't see such willingness right now. Regarding, I think Greece asked about memorialization good practices. I think the key thing is not to have one state-imposed view of history and the past and memory. This means within museums, which are often state or municipal run, to have alternative points of view presented. This means in the educational field, and especially in history, to have alternative views presented and to let students have a debate about, not about the facts, but about how to interpret the facts. This means promoting minority voices within the historical narrative as well. Voices that are generally suppressed or ignored or marginalized, to give them a platform as well. So I think there are a number of good practices that could be promoted in Belarus if there were willing partners, especially from the government side in Belarus. Regarding the question about what change in cultural repression has taken place since 2020 from the UK representative, I think what we have seen is a spike or an increase in the intensity of Russian language promotion on the part of the Belarusian authorities and marginalization of the Belarusian language. We've seen an increase in Russo-Soviet historical narratives. In other words, linking Belarusian statehood to the Soviet Union, downplaying Soviet repression and highlighting ties with Russia. I think the repression of minority cultures has really increased over the last 6 years. And it continues. Anybody with links to the West in particular, and we see this with the repression of the designation of European Humanities University as an extremist organization. What would be the criteria that I would use for fundamental change in Belarus? One is the death penalty. Abolishing the death penalty would be an easy, clear political signal of goodwill and a good human rights step. However, for me, the best sign of fundamental change would be the release of all political prisoners, the end of repression using the arsenal of vaguely defined anti-terrorist and anti-extremist legislation, and clear steps to eradicate torture and detention. We must keep the pressure and the attention on the government of Belarus to bring that day closer. Thank you very much for your interest and for all of your excellent questions.
Muchas gracias.
Thank you very much indeed. That brings us to the end of this dialogue. I should very much like to thank the Rapporteur, Mr. Musniks, for his participation. We'll now take a short technical break before hearing the presentation of the High Commission's reports on Myanmar and Nicaragua.
Procederemos ahora.
We will now proceed with the presentation of the oral update of the High Commissioner on the situation of human rights in Myanmar. I have the honour to give the floor to Mr. Mahaman Siseguru, Director of the Human Rights Council and Treaty Mechanisms Division, to present the report.
Thank you. Mr. Vice President, Excellencies, distinguished delegates, I'm pleased to present the High Commissioner's report on Myanmar, submitted for your consideration under item 4 of the agenda. Over 5 years after the 2021 military coup, the human rights situation in Myanmar has never been more dire. Armed conflicts continue to engulf the country. The military continues to intensify airstrike and artillery attack against civilian communities and essential infrastructure. The consequences are devastating. Civilian deaths continue to rise. Suffering deepens. Economic collapse and regional instability further test the resilience of Myanmar's people. As of 25th June, the widely respected Assistant Association for Political Prisoners have verified the killing of at least 8,122 civilians by the military since the coup, including 1,791 women and 1,078 children. The military has completely failed to take steps to protect the civilian population and mitigate the destructive forces they routinely unleashed. The human cost is staggering. More than 3.7 million people have been displaced by violence. Some 12.4 million face acute hunger. Yet, the military continues to obstruct humanitarian assistance, maintaining blockades and restrictions that deny life-saving aid to those who need it most. Excellencies, the report we are representing today details violations committed during the military-controlled election held between late December 2025 and 25th January 2026. The findings are clear. Even while organizing these elections, the military intensified its campaign of violence. During the election period alone, at least 702 civilians were killed, including 224 women and 153 children. Of those, 505 were killed in attacks carried out using jet fighters, drones, paramotors, and gyrocopters. All the while, villages in several communities were pressured to queue at polling stations. Ballots were cast under the shadow of bombs. This election took place in an environment of fear. More than 22,000 people remain imprisoned on political grounds. More than 400 individuals were prosecuted for allegedly violating newly imposed electoral rules. This, or the release of President Win Myint into a situation akin to house arrest, and the reported change in place of detention of State Councillor Aung San Suu Kyi earlier this year do not amount to their liberty. They must be released immediately and unconditionally, together with all those arbitrarily detained. Those who spoke against the election face severe punishment. One person was sentenced to 49 years imprisonment for distributing anti-election materials. Across the country, civilians were pressured to participate, threatened if they refused, and punished if they objected. This military-led process lacked the most basic elements of credibility. It was overwhelmingly rejected by the people of Myanmar, who continue to demand democracy, justice, and human rights. Clearly, the situation since the election has not been one of improvement or increased protection on the ground. Attacks targeting civilians by the military continue to intensify, with scores of casualties from airstrike in recent months. New repressive measures, including increased powers to search and arrest, have been introduced. Mr. Vice President, across Myanmar, in communities not fully controlled by the military, civil society organizations, women's groups, youth networks, teachers, doctors, nurses, human rights defenders, and local governance structures are stepping in to fill gaps left by conflict and obstruction. They have protected communities and saved lives. Communities have established early warning systems despite internet shutdowns and severe resource constraint. They monitored aircraft movement around the clock. They use walkie-talkies, loudspeakers, radios, bells, and other means to warn civilians on impending attacks. This system saved lives, including the young, the elderly, and the disabled. Across Myanmar, local monitoring groups, independent journalists, and human rights defenders have worked under extraordinary risks to warn communities of impending attacks, document violations, identify emerging threats, and provide timely information that strengthens protection and humanitarian response. Yet, as international support has declined, communities have been asked to do more with less, while the military's access to drone, heavy weapons, and dual-use equipment have expanded. In these circumstances, documentation efforts on the ground are not just a concrete protection measures that helps deter abuse, they are essential for future accountability and they require international support. Protective infrastructures has also become a lifeline. Across Myanmar, communities constructed bunkers and shelters to reduce the impact of aerial bombardments. Many of these efforts were funded by communities themselves. Yet, military restrictions on construction materials continue to undermine these life-saving initiatives. Emergency healthcare services delivered by local actors have saved countless lives. Mobile clinics, volunteers, ambulance services, and frontline health workers have continued to operate despite violence, blockades, and dwindling resources. Their courage and commitment has been remarkable. Their need for support is urgent. Excellencies, local protection mechanisms work. They save lives, but they cannot survive on resilience alone. We urge this Council to continue to stand with the people of Myanmar and their democratic aspirations. Member States need to support the resilience of local community structure with predictable and adequate funding. Every reduction in support weakens protection system, limits humanitarian assistance, and places more civilians at risk. We reiterate our previous call for the cessation of transfers of arms and dual-use equipment to the military. Regional diplomacy and international efforts need to put the democratic movement at the center of their priorities. They must not reward effort by a brutal and repressive military to seek international recognition and legitimacy. The people of Myanmar have shown enormous courage. They must not be left to face this crisis alone. I thank you for your attention.
Muchas gracias por su...
Thank you very much for the presentation. We will now proceed with the presentation of the oral update of the High Commissioner on the situation of human rights in Nicaragua. I have the honor to give the floor to Mr. Mahaman Sissogo to present the oral update. You have the floor.
Mr. Vice President, Excellencies, distinguished delegates, I will now give you an oral update on Nicaragua, still under item 4 of the agenda, as requested by resolution 58/18. Over the past years, the situation or the human rights situation in Nicaragua has remained extremely fragile, with no significant improvement since we last reported to this Council. Regretfully, Nicaragua has not resumed cooperation with this Council, the Universal Periodic Review, the human rights mechanisms, and with OECHR. More than 800,000 persons have reportedly fled abroad in the context of the human rights crisis that started in 2018. The rule of law has been hollowed out through the steady erosion of democratic institutions and the growing concentration of power in the presidency. We repeatedly warned against last year's sweeping constitutional reforms. 5 opposition parties are effectively banned, including the main indigenous party. The ruling party exercised total control over parliament, all municipalities, and the North and South Caribbean Coast Regional Council, undermining the autonomy of indigenous and Afro-descendant people. Civic space is almost entirely shut, and any independent expression of thought or opinion is suppressed. Since 2018, 56 media outlets have been closed, and some 300 journalists and media workers forced into exile. More than 5,600 civil society organizations have had their legal status arbitrarily revoked. Freedom of religion remains severely curtailed, particularly when religious leaders or institutions are perceived as threats to the government. There are also attacks against students and the academic community, as well as women, LGBTIQ+ people, and their organizations. All of this has created a climate of fear, distrust, and censorship, clearly at odds with a safe and enabling human rights environment that would allow a free and meaningful participation of the Nicaraguan people in the general election slated for 2027. Civil society organization indicates that at least 46 people remain arbitrarily detained on political grounds. Our record showed that at least 8 of these cases, many amount to enforced disappearances, as the fate and whereabouts of detainees have long been unknown. Mr. Vice President, we are gravely concerned about detention conditions and the treatment of detainees and their families. Authorities have shown insufficient regard to older people and those in need of medical care. In some cases, this may have contributed to death. This is the case of indigenous Miskitu leader, Brooklyn Rivera, who was held incommunicado for more than 2 years and recently died in custody. Authorities reportedly prevented his family from burying him in accordance with their tradition. Later, his relatives and associates were also detained. We urge their immediate release and call on the authorities to ensure that relatives, associates, and community leaders are not subjected to arbitrary detention, enforced disappearance, or reprisal for seeking truth and justice regarding the fate and whereabouts of the detained relative. Authorities must also respect the family's mourning of their right to honor their relatives according to their own belief. 13 current political detainees are older people in poor health condition, and we call on the authorities to ensure that adequate and timely medical attention is available to them. We note the release of at least 26 political prisoners earlier this year. However, we remain concerned that many reportedly continue to face undue restrictions on the right without a clear legal basis. Beyond its borders, a system of transnational repression keeps exiled Nicaraguans on continuous alert. Since April alone, our office has recorded at least 16 cases involving death threats. Families of exiles already suffering from separation also face threats and reprisals. Hundreds of Nicaraguans have been arbitrarily stripped of their nationality, while thousands more have been denied a renewal of identity documents, exposing them to the risk of statelessness. Mr. Vice President, the rights and lands of indigenous people are being threatened by gold rush, which put their cultural and physical survival at risk. The expansion of large-scale mining concessions to foreign companies has become an important economic lifeline for a government facing sanction and political isolation. Last year saw new laws facilitating the expansion of extractive activities in protected areas, including environmentally sensitive and indigenous territories. They also reduced independent oversight over mining concessions. More than half of the mining concessions granted during the first 5 months of this year affect the Caribbean Coast Autonomous Region, where most of the indigenous and Afro-descendant population live. According to civil society organizations, up to 1/4 of indigenous territory is subjected to mining concession, many issued without appropriate process to guarantee the right to free, prior, and informed consent of indigenous people. Mr. Vice President, we need urgent and full international attention to the situation in Nicaragua for the sake of its people. We call on the government to repeal its anti-democratic reforms, reopen civic space, and restore the rule of law. People of all political opinions must be able to vote and run for office in the next year elections. We urge the immediate release of all those arbitrarily detained. Conditions of detention must be human, and all death in custody must be independently and thoroughly investigated, and we are ready to provide support. We also reiterate our call to Nicaragua to resume constructive dialogue with our office and the human rights system. International human rights mechanisms are not optional. We stress the need for member states to support Nicaraguans in exile, including by protecting them against refoulement and transnational repression. Thank you, Mr. Vice President.
Muchas gracias.
Thank you for your statement. In line with practice, we will now hear the delegation of the concerned country. And I will give the floor to the distinguished representative of Nicaragua. You have 5 minutes.
Veo que Nicaragua nos...
I see that Nicaragua is not present in the room. This brings us to the end of this presentation, and I thank Mr. Mahaman Siseguro for his presentation, for his participation. Excellencies, distinguished participants, I understand that certain delegations have requested to exercise the right of reply, and I give the floor to the distinguished representative of the Republic of Tanzania. You have 3 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Vice President. We would like to exercise the right of reply in response to allegations made by the Special Rapporteur on Burundi concerning the United Republic of Tanzania, as we are seriously concerned by the lack of objectivity in some aspects of the report and strongly rejects the allegation that Tanzania is forcibly returning Burundi refugees in violation of the principle of non-refoulement. These allegations are unfounded and do not reflect the realities on the ground. Burundi has made significant progress in restoring peace, security, and stability, and the circumstances that gave rise to the refugee status for many Burundian refugees have fundamentally changed. We wish to emphasize that...
I apologize for interrupting the distinguished representative in line with established practice in the Council. Replies are exercised under what has been said by a state, not regarding what has been said by a special rapporteur. Thank you. Are there any other states that wish to use the right of reply?
Bien, veo que no es el caso.
I see no requests.
Excelencies, distinguidos colegas.
Excellencies, distinguished colleagues, with this, we have concluded the consideration of agenda item 4. We will now take a short technical break before presenting the report of the working group on the issue of human rights and transnational corporations and other business enterprises. Excellencies, distinguished participants, we will proceed with the presentation of the report of the working group on the issue of human rights and transnational corporations and other business enterprises on the 13th session of the Forum on Business and Human Rights. I now give the floor to Ms. Olayawe, Chair of the Working Group at its 14th session, to present the report through a video message.
Mr. President, Excellencies, distinguished delegates, I am honored to present the report of the Working Group on Business and Human Rights on the 14th United Nations Forum on Business and Human Rights to the Human Rights Council, which took place from 24 to 26 November 2025 in Geneva. The forum is guided and chaired by the Working Group and organized by its Secretariat at the Office of the United Nations High Commissioner for Human Rights. The forum is the world's largest global conference on business and human rights, bringing together participants from states, businesses, investors, community groups, civil society organizations, UN bodies, national human rights institutions, trade unions, academia, and the media. The forum drew its largest audience till date, with more than 4,600 participants from 146 countries, 3,600 attending in person, and 1,060 joining virtually. The theme of the 14th session of the forum, Accelerating Action on Business and Human Rights Amidst Crisis and Transformations, guided the discussions. The program comprised 2 plenary sessions and 20 parallel sessions organized by the Working Group in cooperation with the OHCHR, partner organizations, and other stakeholders, following an open call for proposals, which generated more than 300 proposals. Topics discussed included just transition, environmental accountability, artificial intelligence, labor migration, human rights due diligence in small and medium-sized enterprises, investors, development finance institutions, heightened human rights due diligence in conflict-affected areas, access to remedy and certification and verification systems, diversity, equity, and inclusion, and at groups at risk, including indigenous peoples, human rights defenders, and women and girls. The forum's agenda further included 6 informal dialogues designed to encourage direct, structured, thematic exchange and networking among diverse participants, as well as 2 consultations, one on agribusiness, food security, and human rights, and the other on corporate governance, business, and human rights, to support the Working Group's 2026 thematic reports to the Human Rights Council and to the General Assembly, respectively. In these sessions, participants considered how states and businesses are fulfilling their respective duties and responsibilities under the guiding principles on business and human rights, the UNGPs, at a time marked by geopolitical tensions, conflict, widening inequalities, rapid technological advancements, climate change, environmental degradation, and increasingly complex global value chains. They examined the main drivers and contextual factors of overlapping crises and transformations, and the need for businesses, states, and other stakeholders to develop innovative solutions and approaches to ensure that respect for human rights by businesses was upheld in those contexts, and that business actions or omissions did not exacerbate or compound the negative impact of such crisis. Excellencies, the report provided a broad overview of key observations and messages emerging from the discussions that took place over 3 days in the current report. It indicates that current interlocking crises and profound transformations are placing unprecedented strain on both the protection and realization of human rights. In this context, while states and businesses are increasingly acknowledging their responsibilities to protect and respect those rights, sustained political will, principled leadership, and a shared sense of purpose are urgently needed to overcome the persistent challenges and barriers that remain. The report underlines that state action to strengthen mandatory human rights due diligence and ensure access to effective remedy for victims remains critical, including through renewed and strengthened commitment to the UNGPs. Businesses, which have an independent responsibility to respect human rights, must therefore be more proactive in integrating the guiding principles across their value chains and in their corporate policies, procurement standards, and operational level grievance mechanisms. States should ensure conditions that encourage rather than discourage their efforts. At the same time, businesses ought to support and not weaken state initiatives to achieve the smart mix of measures. Excellencies, against this background, the working group decided that the theme of the 15th UN Forum on Business and Human Rights will be, and I quote, UNGPs at 15, building on gains, confronting gaps, and reimagining the future, end of quote. This forum will provide a multi-stakeholder platform to reflect upon the positive impacts and enduring obstacles seen in the application and implementation of the UNGPs by states and businesses, and in providing access to effective remedies for right holders over the past 15 years. It will also discuss ideas on the ways forward towards ensuring long-term embedding of policies and practices consistent with the UNGPs. The 2026 forum will take place in Geneva from 23 to 25 November 2026. I look forward to your participation in this new edition. Thank you for your attention.
Muchas gracias.
Thank you. Excellencies, distinguished participants, this brings us to the end of this meeting. We will reconvene tomorrow at 10 a.m. to start the adoption of the outcome of the reviews of the 51st session of the Working Group on the UPR. I hereby close the 22nd meeting of the 62nd session of the Human Rights Council. Thank you.